In the tangled backwoods of southeastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian foothills meet the Cumberland Plateau, there exists a story local historians have quietly debated for more than a century and a half. Court records from 1847 mention an unusual civil case involving two Negro women of extraordinary stature and a transaction so peculiar the presiding judge ordered the testimony sealed. The town clerk's handwritten note in the margin reads simply, "God, help us all." Three families who lived through those events left behind contradictory accounts, each sworn under oath, each impossible to fully believe. What happened when a struggling Kentucky farmer made a choice that should have destroyed him, only to receive an offer that defied every principle of the era? The truth, buried in forgotten county archives and family Bibles, is more unsettling than any legend. Before we continue with the story of Silas Harrigan and the two women who changed everything he believed about mercy and survival, if you're listening from Kentucky, Tennessee, or anywhere along the old river routes where these events unfolded, leave a comment telling us where you're from. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more forgotten American mysteries, and let's discover together what really happened on that November morning in 1847. The story begins not with heroism, but with a desperation so complete it had its own smell. Unwashed skin, sour whiskey breath, and the particular odor of dreams rotting in Kentucky clay. The autumn of 1847 found Silas Harrigan precisely where he'd been for 6 years, shin-deep in creek mud, trying to coax something, anything, from 40 acres of stubborn Kentucky clay. At 34, he looked a decade older. Deep lines bracketed his mouth. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle by candlelight, now trembled most mornings until the first drink. The farm sat 12 miles south of Barbourville, in a hollow so narrow the sun only reached the cabin for 4 hours each winter day. Locals called it Harrigan's Hole, though never to his face. Some said the land was cursed. Others said Silas had simply chosen poorly, picking a plot that would break any man's back and spirit. His wife, Ruth, had died in childbirth 3 years prior, taking their only son with her. The small wooden cross he'd carved still stood by the eastern fence line, weathered gray as the stones around it. He'd planted wildflowers there the first spring after her death. By the second spring, he couldn't bring himself to look at the grave. By the third spring, he'd stopped counting days entirely. Time became a blur of failed crops, mounting debts, and bottles emptied in the dark. Harrigan wasn't a man given to philosophy or politics. He'd been raised Methodist, taught that hard work and godliness would be rewarded in this life and the next. But 3 years of evidence suggested otherwise. He knew his neighbors whispered about his drinking, about the way he'd let the fields go to thistle and broom sedge after Ruth's death. The Methodist congregation had stopped including him in their Sunday invitations. When he walked into town, conversations quieted. People found reasons to cross the street. He'd become what every small community feared, a reminder that tragedy could strike anyone, that God's grace was distributed with mysterious unfairness. He owed the dry goods store in town $47, a fortune he had no way to repay. The store owner, a pinched-faced man named Carmichael, had started making pointed comments about when payment might be expected. Soon those comments would become demands, then threats, then legal action. Harrigan had seen it happen to other farmers. They lost everything. Some moved west. Some moved into poverty so complete they became invisible. Some simply disappeared, leaving behind only questions and unpaid debts. His nearest neighbor, a tanner named Vernon Pitts, lived 2 miles west along a path that became impassable in heavy rain. Vernon had tried in the early days after Ruth's death to be helpful. He'd brought food, offered to help with the harvest, invited Silas to supper. But Harrigan had rebuffed every gesture, retreating further into his grief and his whiskey until even patient Vernon gave up. Now they maintained the bare minimum of neighborly relations, a wave from a distance, a nod at church functions Silas rarely attended. Kentucky in 1847 existed in a state of nervous tension. The state allowed slavery but sat precariously close to free territories across the Ohio River. This geographic reality created constant anxiety among slaveholders and complicated social dynamics for everyone else. Barbourville itself housed barely 300 souls, but the surrounding Knox County held 22 substantial plantations, each working between 15 and 60 enslaved people. The town square featured an auction block where enslaved people were sold on the first Monday of each month. Harrigan had witnessed several such sales. They made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate, so he simply avoided town on those Mondays. The peculiar institution, as polite society called it, created a pyramid of wealth and fear. At the top sat the plantation owners, the Talbots, the Covingtons, the Davenports, families who'd claimed Kentucky land in the 1780s and built fortunes on tobacco, hemp, and human labor. Below them were the professional class, lawyers, doctors, merchants who serviced the plantation economy. Then came the middling farmers with 5 to 10 enslaved workers. Below them were the poor white farmers like Harrigan, who owned their land but worked it themselves. They occupied an uncomfortable position, above enslaved people in legal status and social standing, but below plantation owners in every practical measure. They worked their own land barely while watching wealthier men prosper from labor they'd never dirty their hands with. This created a strange psychology. Poor white farmers like Harrigan were encouraged to view enslaved people as threats to their economic position, competitors for work and wages. Simultaneously, they were expected to support the institution of slavery as essential to Southern prosperity and white supremacy. The tension between economic resentment and racial solidarity was resolved through brutal simplicity. Whatever their differences with wealthy planters, poor whites were taught they had more in common with the richest slaveholder than with the most skilled enslaved worker. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 remained in force, and Kentucky slaveholders took it seriously. Bounty hunters, slave catchers, and patrollers moved through the region like wolves, always watching for runaways heading north. The reward for a captured runaway could feed a poor family for half a year. Some men made careers of it. Others simply kept their eyes open, knowing that turning in a fugitive meant favor with the local gentry, and favors meant credit, meant leniency when the tax collector came around, meant your name mentioned in parlors where decisions about the county's future were made. Harrigan tried not to think about such things. He had enough trouble keeping himself alive without pondering the great moral questions of the age. But the questions, as questions do, were about to find him in a way that would force him to decide who he was and what he believed about mercy, justice, and the price of a man's soul. The farm itself told the story of his decline. The western field, which should have been planted with winter wheat, lay fallow. The chicken coop Ruth had insisted on painting bright red now showed bare gray wood through flaking paint. The well needed a new rope. The cabin's roof leaked in 3 places. He'd set buckets under the worst spots and learned to sleep around the dripping. The vegetable garden Ruth had kept so carefully had returned to wilderness. Sometimes at night, drunk and half-dreaming, he could see her there, kneeling in the dirt, her hands dark with soil, her face bright with satisfaction at a job done well. Then he'd wake fully and see only weeds. He owned 1 mule, an ancient creature named Jackson, who was stubborn as original sin and twice as mean. The mule had outlived 2 owners before Harrigan bought him for $8 he couldn't afford. Jackson had also outlived Ruth, which seemed cosmically unfair. The mule was 23 years old and showed no signs of dying. Harrigan suspected Jackson would outlive him, too, just to be contrary. His only other livestock consisted of 4 chickens who produced eggs irregularly and a half-wild pig he'd traded for last spring. The pig lived in the woods mostly, showing up only when it smelled food. Harrigan had named it Judas for reasons that seemed funny when he was drinking. The cabin was a single room, 16 feet square, built from chinked logs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rope bed frame held a corn shuck mattress that Ruth had sewn. A table, 2 chairs, and a handful of cooking implements completed the furnishings. On a shelf over the door sat Ruth's Bible, her name inscribed in careful script on the inside cover, Ruth and Carpenter Harrigan, born 1815, married 1840. The death date remained unwritten. Harrigan couldn't bring himself to mark the page, as if leaving it blank might somehow mean she wasn't really gone. He kept his rifle propped by the door. It was a Pennsylvania long rifle his father had carried in the War of 1812. The barrel was scratched, and the stock had been repaired twice, but it shot straight. Harrigan cleaned it religiously, the only thing he maintained properly. Some nights he'd sit with the rifle across his knees, running an oiled cloth down the barrel, and think about how easy it would be. 1 shot, quick, final. No more debts, no more grief, no more watching the farm Ruth had loved decay around him. But he never did it. Partly from fear of hell, the Methodists were very clear about suicide, and partly from a stubborn streak that Ruth had found alternately endearing and infuriating. If life wanted to beat him down, he'd make it work for the victory. He wouldn't give death the satisfaction of surrender. November had arrived cold and early that year. The leaves had turned and fallen by the end of October, weeks ahead of schedule. Old-timers said it meant a hard winter coming. The Farmer's Almanac predicted heavy snows. Harrigan needed to cut more firewood, needed to repair the roof, needed to do a dozen things he didn't have the energy or money to accomplish. So he did what he'd been doing for 3 years. He woke each morning, took a drink to steady his hands, did the minimum necessary to keep himself and his animals alive, and tried not to think about tomorrow. November 14, 1847, dawned cold and colorless. Harrigan woke before sunrise as he always did, his breath clouding in the cabin's single room. The fire had died to ash overnight. He could see frost on the inside of the window, a sure sign the temperature had dropped below 20 degrees. His body ached with the particular stiffness of a man who'd slept badly in the cold. His head throbbed. His mouth tasted like copper and regret. He reached for the bottle he kept by the bed, not for cold, but from need. The bottle was brown glass, unlabeled, filled with corn whiskey he bought from a still operator who lived 8 miles north. It wasn't good whiskey. It burned going down and left him feeling worse afterward. But it was cheap, and it dulled the edges of everything, which was all he asked of it. He took one swallow, then another, feeling the burn spread through his chest. Enough to steady his hands. Not enough to cloud his thinking. Not yet. That would come later, after the day's meager work was done. He pulled on his clothes, wool pants worn thin at the knees, a linen shirt that had once been white, a jacket Ruth had sewn that no longer fit properly since he'd lost weight. His boots were a particular problem. The right one had a hole worn through the sole, and he'd stuffed it with cloth to keep his foot off the ground. The left boot's laces had broken, replaced with twine. He looked like what he was, an encircling failure, too proud to admit it and too tired to fight it. He stepped outside. Frost covered everything, turning the world into something from a fairy tale, beautiful and deadly. The trees stood black against a pale gray sky, their branches like cracks in porcelain. His breath came in white puffs. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. The sound echoed across the hollow, lonely as judgment. The chicken coop door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. Damn. He'd forgotten to latch it again. His mind was getting worse, losing track of simple tasks. The fox would come. The fox always came when you gave it an opening. He'd lost 2 chickens to that fox already this year, and he couldn't afford to lose more. But when he approached the coop, the chickens were still there, huddled together for warmth in the corner, eyeing him with that blank suspicion that chickens had perfected over centuries of domestication. 4 pairs of beady eyes watched him. 4 sets of feathers ruffled in the cold. All present, all accounted for. But something had spooked them. Their water dish had overturned, the water frozen into an irregular puddle. Scattered feed lay in the dirt. They'd kicked it around in their panic. The rooster, normally aggressive, was pressed into the back corner, silent and alert. Harrigan's gaze moved past the coop toward the tree leaned 60 yards distant. The forest there was thick, oak, hickory, and pine growing so dense that even in winter with the leaves down, visibility barely penetrated 30 feet. It was good hunting land when he had the energy to hunt. Now it just felt oppressive, like the trees were watching him, judging him for his failures. There, something moved. His stomach clenched. His hand instinctively went to his belt where he'd once carried a knife. But the knife was in the cabin. He was unarmed, cold, and half-drunk. Whatever was out there had all the advantages. The shape moved again, resolving slowly into something that made his breath catch and his mind struggle to comprehend what his eyes reported. 2 figures emerged from the forest. Women. That was his first thought. His second thought was that something was wrong with his eyes. Because these women couldn't possibly be as large as they appeared. They had to be closer than he thought, the morning light playing tricks with perspective and distance. But they kept coming, and the scale didn't change. They were actually, genuinely, impossibly huge. They moved slowly, each step careful and deliberate, like people walking on broken glass. They wore rough slave clothing, simple Osnaburg shifts, the kind enslaved field workers wore. The fabric was coarse, undyed, and now torn and filthy from days of rough travel. Their shifts hung loose, designed for labor rather than modesty. No shoes. Their feet were bare, exposed to the frost-covered ground, and even from 60 yards away, Harrigan could see they were injured, bleeding, swollen, more damaged than mere blisters could explain. But it was their size that froze Harrigan in place, made him forget the cold and the chickens and everything else. The first woman stood at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe more. It was hard to judge at this distance, but she towered over anything around her, broad across the shoulders with arms thick as most men's thighs. Her frame wasn't thin or elongated like someone stretched on a rack. She was proportional, built like a normal woman scaled up by half, powerful, formidable. The second was even taller, close to 7 feet, Harrigan guessed, though his mind struggled to accept what his eyes reported. She was built similarly to the first woman, though her frame carried less muscle. Where the first woman moved with controlled strength, the second moved with the unsteady gait of someone near collapse. She swayed with each step. Her companion kept a protective hand on her elbow, steadying her, guiding her. Their skin was darker than most enslaved people Harrigan had seen around Barbaville, deep brown, almost blue-black in the early morning light. Their hair was cropped close to their skulls, probably to prevent it from being grabbed in a fight or a chase. Their faces carried a distinctive look, high cheekbones, broad noses, eyes set wide apart. There was something regal about their features, something that suggested ancestry from somewhere far from Kentucky, far from America entirely. The first woman, the stronger one, had a scar across her left cheek, pale against her dark skin. It was an old scar, healed years ago, running from her ear to the corner of her mouth. The second woman's right hand was swollen to twice its normal size, the knuckle split and bleeding, the kind of injury you got from hitting something hard. Or someone. As they emerged fully from the tree lean, Harrigan could see more details that made his stomach turn. Whip marks crisscrossed their backs, visible through tears in their shifts. Some of the wounds were old, healed to raised scars. Others were fresh, angry, red, weeping. The taller woman's feet weren't just injured. They were raw meat, bleeding from dozens of cuts. She'd walked so far on those feet that they'd essentially disintegrated. How she was still standing was a mystery. How she was still moving was impossible. They stopped 30 feet from the cabin, just stopped, standing there in the frost-covered grass, saying nothing. The stronger woman's eyes scanned the cabin, the yard, the chicken coop, Harrigan himself, cataloging everything, assessing threats and opportunities with the quick intelligence of someone who'd learned to read situations fast or die. The taller woman swayed again. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. She was running on nothing but will. Harrigan had seen that look before in the eyes of men pushed beyond what human bodies should endure. She had hours left, maybe less. They stood there saying nothing, just watching him, waiting. Harrigan's mind raced through calculations with the speed of pure panic. Runaways. Had to be. Those clothes, those wounds, that desperate silence. Everything screamed fugitives, which meant their owner was looking for them, which meant a reward, which meant $47 paid to the dry goods store. Maybe 50, maybe more for women this unusual. Women this large would have been valuable property. Expensive property. The kind of property their owner wouldn't give up easily. His hand moved toward the rifle propped by the door. Not to shoot. He wasn't even sure what he was doing. Just moving on instinct, reaching for something solid and deadly when faced with a situation he couldn't understand. Water, the stronger woman said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried clearly in the cold morning air. Please. English. She spoke English. Clear, unaccented English. Not all enslaved people did, especially not the ones fresh from the auction blocks. Harrigan's grandfather had told stories about cargo ships, about people stolen from Africa who arrived speaking languages nobody around them understood, people who never learned more than a handful of English words necessary for taking orders. But these women spoke, which meant they'd been here a while, which meant they'd been owned by someone for years, which meant someone nearby was missing valuable property, which meant someone nearby wanted them back. Please, the woman said again. She coughed. A wet, rattling sound that spoke of fluid in her lungs. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth, bright red against her dark skin, stark as a warning. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, leaving a smear across her cheek. Harrigan's hand fell away from the rifle. He didn't make a conscious decision. His body simply moved, crossing the yard, approaching these two impossibly large women who could probably snap his neck without effort if they chose to. The stronger one tensed as he approached, her good hand curling into a fist, her body shifting slightly, moving between Harrigan and her companion, protective, ready. But she didn't strike. She just watched him with eyes that held more exhaustion than fear. Eyes that had already seen the worst humans could do to each other and were simply waiting to see which version of humanity he represented. Up close, the true extent of their injuries became visible, and Harrigan felt something twist in his chest. Whip marks crisscrossed the stronger woman's back, old scars layered with fresh wounds. Someone had beaten her recently, beaten her badly. The wounds were infected. He could see yellow pus at the edges of some cuts. The taller woman's feet were worse than he'd thought. They weren't just cut. The soles had been shredded by miles of rough terrain. He could see exposed flesh, could see dirt and debris embedded in the wounds. She should have been screaming. Instead, she just stood there swaying, her eyes half closed. Both women's faces were gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin stretched tight with hunger. Their arms were thin, ribs visible through the torn shifts. They'd been starving before they ran. Running had made it worse. They looked like they'd lost 20 pounds each in the past week. "Come inside," Harrigan heard himself say. The words came out before he'd thought them through, before he'd considered consequences or laws or anything beyond the basic human impulse to bring suffering creatures out of the cold. "Before someone sees you." The stronger woman studied him for a long moment, calculating, deciding. Then she nodded once, helped her companion take a step, then another. They moved toward the cabin with the careful slowness of people who knew their bodies were near complete breakdown. They moved into the cabin like wild animals entering a trap. Slow, cautious, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The stronger woman kept herself between Harrigan and her companion, never fully turning her back. Her eyes scanned the single room, noting the rifle, the knife on the table, the windows, the door, escape routes, weapons, threats. The taller woman collapsed as soon as she crossed the threshold, just folded, her legs giving out entirely. She hit the floor hard enough to shake the cabin. The stronger woman knelt beside her immediately, cradling her head in her lap, murmuring something in a language Harrigan didn't recognize. Not English, not any native language he'd heard traders speak. Something else entirely, something that sounded old, foreign. Harrigan stood in his own doorway, suddenly unsure. He'd invited runaways into his home. The legal penalty for harboring fugitive slaves was 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine, a fortune that might as well have been $1 million. He didn't have $1,000. He didn't have 10. When the law came, and the law always came, they'd seize his land, his cabin, everything Ruth had loved. They'd take it all and leave him with nothing. He could still fix this. He could ride to town right now, tell Carmichael at the dry goods store, tell the magistrate. They'd send men. The women would be gone by noon. And Harrigan would be a hero, a good citizen who'd done his duty. His debts would be forgiven. His credit restored. People would talk to him again, welcome him back into the community. All he had to do was choose his own survival over theirs. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, too loud, too abrupt. The stronger woman looked up at him. "Clara," she said. Her voice was deeper than most women's, but clear and precise, educated. Someone had taught her to speak properly. "This is my sister, Rose." Sisters. That explained the protective hovering, the way Clara's attention never left Rose's face even while talking to Harrigan. Family, the bond that transcended everything else. "Where are you running from?" Clara's jaw tightened. Her eyes hardened. For a moment, Harrigan thought she wouldn't answer. Then, with the weariness of someone who'd calculated the odds and decided truth was her best gamble, Lexington. The Talbot Plantation. Harrigan knew the name. Everyone in central Kentucky knew the Talbots. They owned 3,000 acres worked by over 200 enslaved people. One of the oldest families in the state, descended from Virginia gentry who'd moved west in the 1780s when Kentucky was still the frontier. They bred horses, thoroughbreds that won races in Louisville and Lexington. They raised tobacco that sold for premium prices in New York and Richmond. They owned a townhouse in Lexington, another in Frankfort. They were rich in the way that made other rich people feel poor. And apparently, they'd owned these two women. "Lexington's 150 miles from here," Harrigan said slowly. "You walked that?" "Most of it." Clara glanced down at Rose, whose breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her eyes were closed now. Her skin had taken on a gray pallor. Some nights we rode. In wagons. People helped. Not many, but some. The Underground Railroad. Harrigan knew it existed. Everyone did. But he'd never expected to become part of it. Conductors, they called the people who helped runaways. Stations for the safe houses, a whole secret network of lawbreaking operated by Quakers and free blacks and white abolitionists who believed property rights mattered less than human souls. Harrigan believed in property rights. Always had. A man's property was sacred. That was the foundation of civilization. Without property rights, without the law protecting what a man owned, society collapsed into chaos. You couldn't just take what belonged to someone else, no matter how you felt about it. But these weren't horses or wagons or land. They were people. People who spoke. People who protected each other. People who'd walked 150 miles on bleeding feet because whatever they'd left behind was worse than the bleeding. "I'll get you water," Harrigan said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "And food. Then you have to go." He moved to the water barrel in the corner, filled a tin cup, brought it to Clara. She took it with her good hand, the left one, since her right was swollen and damaged. She held it to Rose's lips. Rose drank desperately, water spilling down her chin, her throat working with each swallow. When the cup was empty, she made a small sound, not quite words, just need. Clara handed the cup back to Harrigan. "Thank you." 2 words, simple, but they carried weight. Acknowledgement. Recognition of risk. Understanding of what even this small kindness cost. "Don't thank me yet. You can't stay here. There'll be men looking, slave catchers, professional hunters. They'll check every farm, every cabin, every barn within 100 miles. When they find you here," he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They all understood. "We know," Clara said, her voice steady despite the desperation in her eyes. "We just need a few hours. Let Rose rest. Get her strength back. Then we'll move on." "To where?" "North. Ohio. Canada." Ohio was 70 miles away. Canada was another 1,000 beyond that. Harrigan looked at Rose, who could barely keep her eyes open, whose feet were destroyed, who was clearly sick with something more than exhaustion. She wasn't going to make it 70 yards, let alone 70 miles. He should turn them in. The thought kept circling back, insistent. He should saddle Jackson, ride to Barbourville, tell Carmichael or the magistrate or anyone who'd listen that he'd found the Talbot runaways, collect the reward, pay his debts, maybe earn enough gratitude from the Talbots to secure credit for next year's seed. It was the sensible thing, the legal thing, the thing any reasonable man would do. Instead, he went to the larder, a small cupboard Ruth had insisted he build, and pulled out the last of his cornbread and the heel of a ham he'd been saving for Sunday dinner. It wasn't much. The cornbread was 2 days old, starting to go stale. The ham was mostly bone and gristle. But it was food, and these women needed food more than he needed Sunday dinner. He brought it to Clara, who stared at the food like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She tore the cornbread in half, gave the larger piece to Rose, who ate it with mechanical desperation, chewing and swallowing without seeming to taste. Clara gnawed on the ham bone, working every scrap of meat from it with her teeth. "Eat," he said unnecessarily. They were already eating. "Both of you. I'll keep watch." He didn't know why he said it. Didn't know what madness had seized him. Didn't know when exactly he decided that 2 runaway slaves mattered more than his own survival. Ruth would have understood. Ruth had always been better than him, kinder than him, more certain about what was right. She would have done the same thing without hesitation. Maybe that's why he was doing it. Maybe he was trying to be the man Ruth had believed he was instead of the drunk failure he'd become. Or maybe he was just tired of making the wrong choice. Tired of choosing survival over decency. Tired of being the kind of man who could watch suffering and do nothing because doing something was inconvenient. He picked up his rifle, positioned himself by the window, and began the wait. They slept. Clara lasted maybe 30 minutes before exhaustion pulled her under. One moment she was sitting upright, alert, watching Harrigan with weary eyes. The next moment, her head dropped forward and she was gone, her body finally surrendering to the demands of days without rest. She slumped against the cabin wall, Rose's head still cradled in her lap, and began to snore softly. Harrigan sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the road. Morning stretched into afternoon. The sun climbed, what little of it penetrated the hollow, and with it came a slight warming. The frost melted. Water dripped from the cabin's roof in a steady rhythm. No one came. That was unusual. On most days, at least one person passed, a peddler, a neighbor, someone traveling between towns for business or visiting family. But November 14th remained quiet. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the hollow. The forest stood silent as a held breath. Around 2 o'clock, Clara awoke. She came to consciousness the way soldiers did, instantly alert, no transition between sleep and wakefulness. She sat up slowly, every movement careful, and looked around the cabin with the thorough gaze of someone cataloging exits and weapons and threats. Her eyes settled on Harrigan, still sitting by the window. "You're still here. It's my cabin. You know what I meant." Harrigan didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what she meant. Or rather, he knew exactly what she meant and didn't have an answer. He was still here because why? Because he'd made a choice and was seeing it through. Because he'd gone too far to turn back. Because some part of him that Ruth had nurtured and his subsequent failures had nearly killed still believed in being decent. "Tell me something," he said, finally deflecting with a question. "Why'd you run?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at Rose, still sleeping, her breathing slightly less labored now. When Clara spoke, her voice carried no emotion, just facts. A report, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "They were going to separate us. Rose and me. Master Talbot's youngest son got married last month, moving to Mississippi, a plantation near Natchez. He wanted to take Rose with him. His new wife had heard about us, about how tall we were, and she wanted Rose as a curiosity. Something to show guests, something to make them talk. A conversation piece. That's what she called Rose. A conversation piece." Harrigan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And you?" "I was supposed to stay. Keep working the fields. They liked how much I could carry, how much work I could do. 2 normal women's work," Master Talbot said. "Worth my feed. Worth the trouble." He liked to bring visitors out to the fields just to watch me work. "Show me off. Look at my giant Negro," he'd say. "Strong as an ox. Probably got giant blood in her somewhere." He made up stories about where we came from. Said our mother had lain with some kind of African giant. Said we were proof of the different races of men. Said we were examples of how breeding could create different types of Negroes. He talked about us the way he talked about his horses. Bloodlines. Characteristics. Value. She said all this in the same flat tone. No anger, no grief, just recitation. But Harrigan could hear what lay beneath, a rage so deep and old it had become part of her bones. "How long have you been together?" "All our lives. We're twins. Born the same night, same mother. She died when we were young. Fever. After that, we only had each other. Twins." That explained the resemblance, the protective instinct, the way Clara wouldn't leave Rose even though running alone would have been easier. They were 2 parts of a whole. Separating them wasn't just cruelty. It was violence against something fundamental. "She's sick," Harrigan said, glancing at Rose. Her color was slightly better now, but her breathing still carried that wet rattle. "I know. But she'll be all right. Rose is stronger than she looks. She looks half dead. Then imagine how strong she must be to still be alive." There was defiance in Clara's voice, a refusal to accept the obvious. Harrigan recognized it. He'd sounded the same way talking about Ruth in those final days, insisting she'd recover even as her pulse grew weaker under his fingers. Sometimes hope was all you had. Sometimes hope was a lie you told yourself because the truth was unendurable. "Why are you so tall?" he asked. The question surprised him. He hadn't meant to ask it, but curiosity overwhelmed propriety. He'd never seen people this size. Never heard of people this size. They seemed impossible. Clara's expression shifted, became guarded. Our mother was tall. Nearly 6 feet. Unusual for a woman. Our father, too, we're told. We never knew him. He was sold away before we were born. But people said he was enormous. 7 feet or more. Master Talbot used to say we had Niam blood, whatever that means. He liked to tell people we were descended from African giants. Made us sound more valuable, more exotic. He'd bring buyers around just to stare at us. Even when we were children. Especially when we were children. Look at these girls, he'd say. They'll be worth a fortune when they're grown. Tall Negroes fetch premium prices. Strong workers. Good breeders. The way she said breeders made Harrigan's stomach turn. He'd heard enough. He didn't want to know more about what the Talbots had planned for these women, what use they'd intended to make of their unusual size. Some truths were too ugly to examine closely. Are there others in your family? No. Just us. Our mother had 3 other children before us. All normal-sized. All sold away before we were born. We never met them, never knew their names. Our mother wouldn't talk about them, said it hurt too much. We were her last. Her strange ones. The way she said it, her strange ones, carried both pride and pain. Harrigan understood that, too. Being different meant being noticed. Being noticed meant never being left alone. It meant being valuable in ways that had nothing to do with your humanity and everything to do with your usefulness to others. A sound outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving fast. The sound carried clearly in the afternoon quiet, the rapid thudding of hooves on dirt road, the jingle of tack, the creak of leather. Coming from the direction of the main road. Coming closer. Harrigan rose, moved to the window. 3 riders were coming up the path from the main road, their horses at a trot. Even at a distance, he recognized the lead rider's posture, the slouched seat, the lazy handling of the reins. Vernon Pitts, his neighbor. Behind him rode 2 men Harrigan didn't recognize, but their purpose was clear from the rifles across their saddles and the coiled rope hanging from one man's belt. Slave catchers. They were here. Seller, Harrigan said, keeping his voice low and urgent. Under the floorboards by the hearth. Get Rose down there. Now. Clara didn't argue, didn't ask questions. She simply moved with surprising speed, lifting Rose like she weighed nothing, though Rose probably weighed 150 pounds or more. Clara cradled her sister against her chest and crossed the cabin in 3 long strides. Harrigan was already pulling up the loose floorboards by the hearth, revealing the cramped space he'd dug out years ago for storing root vegetables over winter. It was barely 4 feet deep and maybe 6 feet square, dirt floor, dirt walls. In the heat of summer, it stayed cool. In the cold of winter, it stayed just warm enough to prevent freezing. But it was small. Too small for 2 women Clara and Rose's size. Clara didn't hesitate. She lowered Rose into the space, laying her on the dirt floor as gently as possible. Then she squeezed herself in after, folding her long frame into an impossibly tight crouch. Her head almost touched the floorboards. Her knees were pressed to her chest. Rose lay curled on her side, taking up most of the space. There was barely room for both of them, but they made it work, Clara wrapping her body around Rose's, making herself as small as possible. Their eyes stared up at Harrigan, wide, frightened, but also trusting. They were putting their lives in his hands. They had no choice. But the trust in their eyes felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. He replaced the floorboards, working quickly. The boards were old, uneven, deliberately loose so he could access the cellar easily, but they still took 3 tries to settle properly. His hands were shaking. Not from whiskey need this time. From fear. Pure animal fear of what was about to walk through his door. He scattered ash over the replaced boards, trying to make them look undisturbed. Then he grabbed the pot Ruth had used for cooking and set it on the hearth as if he'd been warming food. A normal afternoon activity. Nothing suspicious. The knock came just as he settled the pot in place. 3 sharp raps, authoritative, demanding. Harrigan took a breath, wiped his palms on his pants, and opened the door. Vernon Pitt stood there, his face apologetic but determined. He was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall, with thinning hair and a permanent squint from years of working with caustic tanning chemicals. He'd been a decent neighbor once. Now he just looked uncomfortable, like a man caught between competing obligations. "Silas," Vernon said. "Sorry to trouble you. What's this about?" "These gentlemen are looking for runaways. 2 Negro women. Unusually large. They tracked them this far, lost the trail near your property." The taller of the 2 slave catchers stepped forward. He was lean as a whip, maybe 40 years old, with a face that suggested he'd been handsome once before something, whiskey or violence or simple bitterness, had hollowed him out. His eyes were pale blue, cold as January ice. A thin scar ran from his left eyebrow to his hairline. He wore well-made clothes, leather coat, good boots, a hat with a snakeskin band. Professional. Expensive. Successful. "Name's Hollis," he said. His voice was smooth, almost pleasant. "Work for the Talbot family out of Lexington. We've been tracking these women for 4 days. They came through here." "We know they did." "Haven't seen anyone," Harrigan said. Hollis smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who'd spotted prey trying to hide. "Mind if we look around?" "I do, actually." The smile vanished. "State law says I can search any property when I'm pursuing fugitives. Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. You can cooperate or you can obstruct. One of those options ends badly for you." Vernon shifted uncomfortably. "Silas, just let them look. If you've got nothing to hide, it'll take 5 minutes and they'll be on their way." The second slave catcher hadn't spoken yet. He was younger than Hollis, maybe 25, with nervous energy and darting eyes. He kept his hand on his pistol, fingers drumming on the grip, eager, dangerous in the way that inexperienced men with weapons were dangerous. Harrigan wanted to refuse, wanted to stand his ground, protect his property, assert his rights as a free white man with his own land. But he'd seen what happened to people who obstructed slave catchers. They had the law on their side. They had the backing of every plantation owner in the state. They had the weight of the entire social order. Fighting them was fighting everything. And Harrigan was one man, poor and drunk and holding on by his fingernails. He had no power, no influence, no protection. He stepped aside. The 3 men entered. Hollis moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and purposeful. He'd done this 100 times before. Knew where people hid runaways. Knew what to look for. He checked the corners, lifting blankets, moving furniture. Opened the larder, looked inside the water barrel. Checked behind the curtain that separated Harrigan's sleeping area from the rest of the cabin. The young slave catcher poked at the walls, testing for false panels. He rapped on the logs with his knuckles, listening for hollow sounds. Vernon stood by the door, looking like he wished he were anywhere else. "Cozy place," Hollis said conversationally. "Bit run down, though. You keeping up the farm all right, Harrigan?" "Well enough. Heard you owe money in town. Heard your credit's gone thin. Heard Carmichael's threatening legal action." He paused, let the words sink in. "That's a hard situation for a man." "None of your business." "Might be my business. See, there's a substantial reward for these women. $300 each." He let the number hang in the air, watching Harrigan's face for reaction. "That's money that could solve a lot of problems for a man in your position." $600. The number hit Harrigan like a physical blow. He'd never held $600 in his life. Couldn't imagine what $600 looked like all in one place. That wasn't just debt paid. That was a new start. New seed for spring. New livestock. New everything. $600 was the difference between survival and starvation, between keeping the farm Ruth had loved and losing it to foreclosure. All he had to do was point at the hearth. Hollis moved closer to the fireplace. He was 3 feet away, 2 feet, close enough to feel the heat from the pot Harrigan had set there. Close enough to see the ash pattern on the floor. Close enough to notice, if he looked down with a careful eye, that the ash had been recently disturbed, that the pattern wasn't natural, that someone had scattered it deliberately. You know, Hollis said, his voice still conversational, harboring fugitives carries serious penalties. 6 months in prison. $1,000 fine. Property seizure. But information leading to capture, that's different. That's civic duty. That's good neighborly conduct. That's rewarded. He looked directly at Harrigan. His pale eyes were knowing. They said he'd been doing this long enough to read guilt in a man's face, to see the micro-expressions that betrayed lies. He knew. Somehow, he knew. Harrigan's mouth opened. Words formed on his tongue. For a terrible moment, he wasn't sure what would come out. Confession. Denial. Some desperate bargain. Then Rose coughed. It was a small sound, barely audible, muffled by the floorboards and ash. But in the cabin's silence, it rang like a church bell, unmistakable, human. Hollis's head snapped toward the hearth. The young slave catcher drew his pistol. Vernon made a small sound of distress. Time stretched. Harrigan could see every detail with crystal clarity, dust motes floating in the shaft of sunlight from the window, the grain pattern in the floorboards, the exact angle of Hollis's head as he turned toward the sound, the way the young slave catcher's thumb pulled back the hammer on his pistol, one click, loud as breaking bone in the silence. Hollis took a step toward the hearth, then another. He was going to check, going to lift those boards, going to find Clara and Rose huddled in that tiny space. And then everything, Harrigan's choice, his risk, his one decent act in 3 years of failure, would be for nothing. Wait, Harrigan said. His voice came out steady. He was surprised by that. He'd expected it to shake. Hollis paused, looking up. Something you want to tell me? Harrigan's thoughts raced. There was no way out. No clever lie that would explain that cough. No distraction that would make 3 men forget what they'd heard. His only options were surrender the women or fight 3 armed men in his own home. Neither option ended well for him or for Clara and Rose. But maybe, and this thought came with a strange clarity, like sunlight breaking through clouds, maybe it wasn't about ending well. Maybe it was about ending right. The women you're looking for, Harrigan said slowly, choosing each word with care, they're not here. Hollis stood. His hand moved to his pistol. We just heard. You heard my pigs, Harrigan interrupted. Under the cabin. I keep them there in winter. Warmer than the pen outside. One of them's got a cough. Been meaning to slaughter it, but I hate to waste meat on an animal that's sick. Hard to sell sick pork. It was the stupidest lie Harrigan had ever told. Pigs didn't sound like people. Their coughs were different, guttural, animalistic. And no farmer kept livestock under their cabin in a root cellar. It was unsanitary, impractical. The pigs would dig up the dirt floor, disturb the vegetables stored there. It made no sense. But he said it with such absolute conviction, with such tired frustration at having his farming practices questioned by strangers, that Hollis hesitated. Pigs, Hollis repeated flatly. Pigs. You want to crawl under there and check, be my guest. Watch for the sow, though. She's mean when strangers come around. Bit Vernon's boy last month. Drew blood. Vernon, bless him, caught on. Silas did mention he was keeping livestock close this year after that fox problem in September. The young slave catcher looked uncertain. We should check. We should move on, Hollis said abruptly. He straightened, his hand leaving his pistol. His eyes stayed on Harrigan's face, searching for cracks in the lie. The tracks continued east toward Bell County. We're wasting time here. He didn't believe the pig story. Harrigan could see that in his eyes. But Hollis was also doing a calculation. Fighting a white landowner over what might be pigs would look bad. Shooting a man in his own home because you thought you heard something would look worse. And if they checked and found nothing, if somehow the women had escaped while they were talking, or if Harrigan was telling the truth about pigs, then Hollis would have assaulted a citizen for nothing. The Talbots were powerful, but they weren't powerful enough to protect him from that. Especially not when the citizen in question was white and owned land. Poor white men still had some protection under the law. Not much, but some. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes, Harrigan realized, a man's whiteness and property ownership mattered more than his poverty. Sometimes the system protected even its weakest members as long as they looked right and held land. It was an ugly truth, an unfair truth. But in this moment, it was the truth keeping Clara and Rose alive. "We'll be back," Hollis said. His voice was soft, threatening. "If we find out you lied, you'll find I didn't." Hollis held his gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked out, the young slave catcher following. Vernon lingered in the doorway. "Silas," he said quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing." "So do I." Vernon shook his head and left. Harrigan stood at the door, watching the three men mount their horses, watching them ride away down the path toward the main road, watching until they disappeared around the bend and the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence. Only then did his legs start to shake. Only then did the full weight of what he'd just done hit him. He'd lied to slave catchers. He'd obstructed a legal pursuit. He'd committed a crime that could cost him everything. And he'd do it again. That was the strangest part. If Hollis came back right now, Harrigan would lie again. Would keep lying until they dragged him away in chains. When he was certain the men were truly gone, he lifted the floorboards. Clara stared up at him, Rose still cradled in her arms. Both women were barely breathing. The terror in their eyes was absolute, the kind of fear that comes from being hunted like animals, from knowing your life depends entirely on the whims of strangers. "They're gone," Harrigan said. His voice shook now. "You're safe." "Why?" Clara asked. Just that one word, but it contained everything. Why risk this? Why help us? Why choose us over your own survival? Harrigan didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had too many answers. Because Ruth would have wanted him to. Because he was tired of being alone with his failures. Because $600 couldn't buy back his self-respect. Because those women were people, and people deserved better than being hunted like animals. Because maybe doing one decent thing before he died mattered more than survival. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But you can't stay here. They'll come back tonight with more men. They'll search properly next time. They'll find you. Where can we go?" Harrigan thought. He knew people who might help. The Methodist preacher? No. Too visible, too connected to local society. Anyone at church would turn them in immediately. The Quaker family 30 miles north? Possibly. Quakers were known abolitionists. But 30 miles was too far for Rose in her condition. She'd never make it. Then he remembered something. A conversation at the tavern months ago, overheard and dismissed. A drunk farmer talking about a black settlement near the Ohio border. Free people who'd bought their freedom, who'd pooled money to purchase land. Living in a community protected by white allies who believed slavery was wrong. It was supposed to be a secret. But secrets in taverns never stayed secret for long. Most people dismissed it as fantasy, but some of those people had seemed too certain in their dismissal, too emphatic, the way people did when they were hiding something real. "There's a place," he said slowly, thinking it through. "About 40 miles north, near the Ohio line. A settlement. Free blacks and sympathizers. I don't know exactly where, but I've heard enough talk to get close. They'll help you get to Ohio, get you the rest of the way to Canada." 40 miles, Clara said. She looked down at Rose, who was semi-conscious now, her eyes fluttering. "Rose can't. I'll take you. In my wagon. Tonight. Hidden under hay and burlap. We leave at dark." Clara stared at him. For a moment, she seemed unable to process what he was offering. Then tears began to roll down her face, silent, slow, like they'd been held back so long they'd forgotten how to flow. "Why?" she asked again, softer this time, not demanding an answer, just expressing wonder that such kindness could exist. Harrigan helped them out of the cellar. He had no answer to give her that would make sense. He barely understood it himself. He just knew that Ruth would have done this, that the men he wanted to be would do this, that he'd already crossed a line and there was no going back, so he might as well see it through to the end, whatever end that was. They spent the afternoon preparing. Harrigan hitched Jackson to his wagon, a process that took 20 minutes because the mule was contrary and mean and seemed to sense something unusual was happening. The wagon was old, held together by repairs upon repairs, but it still rolled. That was enough. He piled hay in the wagon bed. Not fresh hay, he couldn't afford fresh hay, but old hay from last year's cutting. It was dry and brittle and smelled faintly of rot, but it would hide 2 people if they lay still enough. Clara watched him work. Rose was sleeping inside the cabin, finally resting properly now that the immediate danger had passed. Clara had refused to sleep herself. She stood by the door, keeping watch, her eyes scanning the tree-line constantly. "You should eat something else," Harrigan said. "Build your strength up. Long night ahead. We've eaten more today than we have in a week." "I'll be fine." Harrigan doubted that, but didn't argue. He brought her more cornbread anyway, and this time she ate it without protesting. "Tell me about your wife," Clara said suddenly. "The one you mentioned." "Ruth." Harrigan stopped working. "How did you know?" "You said her name this morning. When you let us in, you whispered it. Maybe you don't remember." He didn't remember, but it sounded like something he'd do. Ruth was always there, hovering at the edge of his thoughts. Sometimes he'd go hours without thinking of her. Then something would remind him, a smell, a sound, a particular quality of light, and it would all come rushing back. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "Childbirth. The baby, too. They're buried by the east fence." "I'm sorry." "So am I." They were quiet for a moment. Then Clara said, "She must have been a good woman." "You're doing this for her, aren't you? This thing you're doing for us?" "Maybe partly. I don't know." Harrigan drove a final nail into a loose board on the wagon. "Mostly I'm doing it because I'm tired of being the kind of man who doesn't." "What kind of man is that?" "The kind who chooses wrong. Who takes the easy path. Who survives by not caring." He looked at her. "The kind of man who could watch 2 people suffer and do nothing because it's not his problem." Clara studied him for a long moment. "You're harder on yourself than the world is. The world hasn't noticed me enough to be hard on me. Maybe that's about to change." She was right about that. By tomorrow, maybe the day after, word would spread. Vernon would talk. Not maliciously, but talk was talk. Hollis would hear about the sick pigs. He'd get suspicious. He'd come back. He'd ask more questions. Someone would remember seeing Harrigan's wagon on the road. Someone would put pieces together. And then Silas Harrigan would become known as a criminal, an abolitionist, a betrayer of his race. All the things he'd never wanted to be. But somehow, standing in the fading afternoon light, watching Clara keep her vigil while her sister slept, Harrigan found he didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, he was doing something that mattered, something Ruth would have been proud of, something that might in some small way justify the space he occupied in the world. As darkness fell, they made their final preparations. Harrigan gave them the last of his food. Not much, just some dried apples and a chunk of salt pork. Clara tried to refuse, but he insisted. "You'll need it more than me. I can shoot a rabbit tomorrow. You need to get to that settlement with some strength left." He'd drawn a rough map based on his memory of tavern conversations. The settlement was somewhere near the Ohio border in a valley protected by hills. There was supposed to be a marker, a specific tree with a white stone at its base. He wasn't certain of the details, but it was something. Better than nothing. At full dark, around 8 o'clock, they were ready. Clara carried Rose to the wagon and laid her in the bed. Rose was conscious now, lucid enough to understand what was happening. She looked at Harrigan with eyes that held a lifetime of suffering and a small, fragile hope. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. "You're saving our lives." "Haven't saved them yet. Long way to go." But Clara climbed in beside her sister. Harrigan covered them with hay, then draped burlap over the hay, then added more hay on top. He worked carefully, making sure they could breathe, making sure they wouldn't suffocate. When he was done, the wagon looked like he was transporting old hay to sell or trade. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. He climbed onto the driver's seat, took up the reins, and clicked his tongue. Jackson, predictably, didn't move. Harrigan clicked again. Still nothing. He slapped the reins against Jackson's back. The mule took one reluctant step, then stopped. I swear to God, Jackson, if you don't move right now, I'll sell you for glue. Jackson, perhaps sensing genuine threat in Harrigan's voice, began to walk slowly, grudgingly, but walking. They left the farm behind and headed north into the darkness. They traveled in silence, the wagon wheels creaking, the mules hooves soft on dirt roads. The night was cold but clear. A half-moon provided just enough light to see by. Harrigan followed hunting trails he hadn't used in years, paths that wound through forests and around farms, avoiding main roads where possible. Every sound made his heart race. Every shadow looked like a mounted patrol. Twice they had to hide when other travelers approached, Harrigan pulling the wagon off the path, waiting in the trees while riders passed. Once they passed a patrol, 3 mounted men with torches, searching the roadside, poking into bushes, checking abandoned buildings. Harrigan just nodded at them, kept driving, his heart hammering so hard he was certain they'd hear it. Evening, one of the patrollers called. You seen any runaways? No, sir. Just heading to my brother's place. Bringing him some hay for his livestock. Long way to carry hay at night. Promised I'd get it to him. Man's got to keep his word. The patroller studied him for a moment, then nodded. Safe travels. Harrigan kept driving. It wasn't until the patrol was out of sight that he allowed himself to breathe properly. Under the hay, he heard Clara let out a shaky breath, too. They'd come within 10 feet of being discovered. They continued north. Hours passed. The landscape changed gradually, flatlands giving way to rolling hills, farmland to forest. Harrigan's arms ached from holding the reins. His back protested every bump in the road, but he kept going. Around midnight, Rose started coughing again. The sound was muffled by the hay, but still audible. Harrigan found a stream, pulled the wagon off the road, and let the women come up for air and water. Clara lifted Rose out carefully, helped her drink from cupped hands. How much further? Clara asked. Maybe 15 miles. Maybe 20. Hard to say in the dark. Will we make it before dawn? I think so. Have to. They couldn't be caught on the road in daylight. Too visible. Too suspicious. A poor white farmer with 2 giant black women in his wagon would attract attention anywhere. Attention meant questions. Questions meant discovery. They rested for 10 minutes, no longer, then continued. Dawn found them approaching what Harrigan hoped was the right area. The map in his head was vague, the landmarks uncertain, but there were hills here and valleys between them and a creek that might be the right creek. He spotted the tree, a massive oak with a white stone at its base, just as the sun broke the horizon. Relief flooded through him. They'd made it. They were close. The settlement wasn't much. A dozen cabins clustered around a small church, surrounded by worked fields. But the people who emerged to meet them were free. Harrigan could see it in the way they moved, the way they held themselves. No fear. No deference. Just caution. An old woman came forward first. She was small, gray-haired, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked at the wagon, at Harrigan, at the hay. Then she nodded as if she'd already figured out what was happening. Dina, she introduced herself. You carrying passengers? 2 women. They need help getting to Ohio. Dina didn't ask more questions. She called for others, and several people came forward to help Clara and Rose from the wagon. Rose could barely walk. 2 men had to support her. Clara followed, her eyes scanning the settlement, still weary, still protective. Dina examined Rose quickly, touching her forehead, listening to her breathing, checking her feet. She made soft clucking sounds of disapproval. Child's half dead. But she'll live. Get her inside. Warm broth. Clean water. Herbs for the fever. They carried Rose into one of the cabins. Clara looked back at Harrigan, her expression complicated, grateful, guilty, worried. You should go, she said. Before full light. Before someone sees you here. I know. But he didn't move immediately. He stood there, suddenly uncertain. He'd brought them this far. Now what? Just leave. Go back to his empty cabin and his failing farm and wait for the consequences of what he'd done. You did a good thing, Dina said. She'd approached without him noticing. Risky. Foolish. But good. I didn't do it to be good. Don't matter why you did it. Matters that you did. She handed him a bundle. Bread. Dried meat. A jar of preserves. More than you gave them. For your journey back. And this. She pressed something else into his hand. Don't look at it now. Wait until you're home. Harrigan nodded. He wanted to say more. Wanted to ask if Clara and Rose would truly make it to Canada. Wanted to know if the settlement was safe. Wanted some assurance that his risk had been worth it. But there were no assurances, no guarantees. Just hope. Clara came back out. She approached Harrigan, moving slowly, her injured hand held carefully. When she reached him, she held out a small cloth bundle. Master Talbot's son, she said quietly. The one getting married, the one who wanted to take Rose. He liked to show off his wealth, kept gold coins in his bedroom. I took these before we ran. She pressed the bundle into Harrigan's hand. For helping us. Harrigan opened the cloth. 3 gold coins gleamed inside. $20 gold pieces. $60 total. Not 600, but more than enough to pay his debts. More than enough to prove that sometimes doing right came with rewards. Even if that wasn't why you did it. I can't take this. You can. You will. We won't need money where we're going. Canada's waiting. But you need it here. For when they come asking questions. For when your neighbors stop talking to you. For when Carmichael demands his money. Her voice was firm. You gave us our lives. These coins are nothing compared to that. He tried to argue, but Clara's expression brooked no debate. She'd made her decision. So he closed his hand around the coins, feeling their weight, and nodded. Thank you, he said. Inadequate words, but the only ones he had. No. Thank you. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I hope your Ruth knows what you did today. I think she'd be proud. Harrigan's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. He just nodded again. Then he climbed onto his wagon, turned Jackson around, and began the long journey home. He never saw them again. That was the hardest part. Not knowing. For weeks, months, years, he wondered. Had they made it to Ohio? To Canada? Were they free? Or had Hollis somehow tracked them down? Had they been captured, returned, punished for running? Rumors reached him later. Bits and pieces gathered from travelers and traders. 2 unusually tall black women had been seen working in a lumber camp near Toronto. They were free, the rumor said, thriving, using their size and strength to earn good wages, living together in a small house they'd built themselves. Whether it was them or someone else, Harrigan never knew. He chose to believe it was them. Chose to believe his risk had been worth it. The Talbot family posted reward notices for months, then years. The notices appeared on the wall of the Barbourville courthouse, at the dry goods store, at the tavern. $300 each for the return of 2 Negro women named Clara and Rose. Property of James Talbot of Lexington, Kentucky. Distinguishing characteristics: unusual height, approximately 6.5 to 7 feet tall. Anyone with information should contact Talbot Plantation immediately. But no one ever collected the reward. The women had disappeared as completely as if they'd never existed. Eventually, the notices came down. The Talbots gave up. Or maybe they just decided that advertising their loss was more embarrassing than accepting it. Hollis never returned to Knox County. Harrigan heard later that the slave catcher had been killed in a fight in Louisville, shot by a free black man he'd tried to kidnap and sell south. The news gave Harrigan a dark satisfaction. Vernon Pitts never mentioned that November day again, but something changed between them. Vernon would wave when they passed on the road, but he never stopped to talk. Never invited Harrigan over. Never asked for help with his tanning work. A distance had opened up. Not hostile. Just careful. As if Vernon had realized that Silas Harrigan was more complicated than he'd thought, and complexity was dangerous. Harrigan used the $60 to pay his debts. He walked into Carmichael's dry goods store on a cold December morning and placed 3 gold coins on the counter. Carmichael stared at them like they might be counterfeit. Then he got out his ledger, carefully noted the payment, and handed Harrigan his receipt. $47 paid in full, Carmichael said. His voice was neutral. Professional. But his eyes were curious. Still leaves you with 13. Keep it. Credit for spring seed. Seed won't be in until March. I'll wait. Carmichael nodded slowly. Where'd you get this money, Silas? If you don't mind my asking. I mind. That was the end of the conversation. Harrigan left the store with his debts paid and his credit restored. For the first time in 3 years, he could hold his head up in town. For the first time in 3 years, he had options. He stopped drinking. Not all at once. The shaking and the sweating made that impossible. But gradually. One day, he took 2 drinks instead of 4, then 1 instead of 2, then none. The whiskey bottle stayed by the bed, but he stopped opening it. Eventually, he poured it out and threw the bottle away. He started working the farm properly, fixed the roof, repaired the chicken coop, planted winter wheat in the western field. It was hard work. His body had forgotten how to do hard work. But slowly, painfully, he built himself back into something resembling the men Ruth had married. 5 years later, in 1852, he remarried. Her name was Margaret, a widow from Barbourville whose husband had died of fever. She had no children and no illusions about romance. They married for practical reasons. She needed someone to work her late husband's land, and Harrigan needed a reason to keep living. It wasn't love, but it became partnership, then respect, then something like contentment. They had 3 daughters. Sarah, born in 1853. Ellen, born in 1855. Mary, born in 1857. Harrigan loved them with a fierceness that surprised him. He told them stories at night, fairy tales, Bible stories, tales of Kentucky's early days, but never his own story. Never about the November morning when 2 women appeared from the forest and changed everything. Sometimes when his daughters asked about the saddest day of his life, he'd shake his head and look toward the eastern fence where Ruth's cross still stood. The day I became the loneliest man in Kentucky, he'd say. And they'd nod, understanding that he meant the day their mother, the first mother, the one they'd never met, had died. But when they asked about his proudest day, he'd smile slightly and say nothing at all. Some stories were too dangerous to tell. Some truths had to stay buried. The Fugitive Slave Act had been replaced by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was even harsher. Admitting what he'd done could still bring legal consequences, could still cost him everything. So he kept his silence. Kept his secret. And on certain November nights, when the frost covered everything and the trees stood black against a pale sky, he'd walk to the eastern fence and stand by Ruth's grave and whisper, "I did something right. Finally. I hope you know." The incident never made it into official history. The sealed court testimony that mentioned 2 Negro women of extraordinary stature was lost in a fire that destroyed the Knox County Courthouse in 1889. The families who knew the truth took their knowledge to their graves. And in the end, all that remained was a story that couldn't quite be confirmed or denied, of a poor farmer who chose mercy over profit and 2 sisters who became legends in the margins of forgotten documents. Years later, in 1875, when Harrigan was 62 and feeling the weight of his years, a letter arrived. It had no return address. The handwriting was careful and precise. Inside was a single page. "We made it. We are free. We think of you often. Thank you for choosing kindness when the world demanded cruelty. You gave us our lives back. We hope you found yours. With gratitude and respect. C&R." Harrigan read the letter 3 times. Then he burned it, watching the paper curl and blacken in the fireplace. Evidence destroyed, safety maintained. But he kept the memory, kept it close, kept it as proof that one decent act could ripple outward in ways you'd never see. He died in 1880, in his sleep, in the cabin he'd shared with Ruth and then with Margaret. His daughters found him in the morning, peaceful, his hands folded on his chest. At his funeral, the Methodist preacher spoke about perseverance and faith. Margaret spoke about his devotion to family. His daughters spoke about his kindness. No one mentioned 2 escaped slaves. No one mentioned a November morning in 1847. No one mentioned gold coins or underground railroads or the price of choosing right over easy. But in the cemetery, standing apart from the other mourners, an elderly black woman watched the burial. She was unusually tall, maybe 6 feet, and she leaned on a cane. When the funeral ended and people began to leave, she approached Margaret. "Your husband," the woman said. Her accent was educated, northern. "He was a good man. Did you know him?" The woman smiled slightly. "Once. A long time ago. In another life." She placed a small cloth bundle on Ruth's grave, the one next to Silas's fresh grave. "Tell his daughters their father saved lives. Tell them he mattered." Then she walked away, disappearing into the crowd before Margaret could ask more questions. Inside the bundle was a $20 gold piece. Payment on a debt that had been settled decades ago. A reminder that sometimes the stories we never tell are the ones that define us most completely. What do you think of this story? Did it really happen? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell and share with someone who loves forgotten American stories. Until next time, remember, the most powerful acts of courage are often the ones history never records.